Horror cinema has given us countless monsters, but few have burrowed as deeply into our collective psyche as Freddy Krueger. The burned man with the bladed glove who kills in dreams has terrified audiences for decades. Yet beneath the makeup and special effects lies a story that touches on profound psychological truths about trauma, abandonment, and the monster society creates. This is an exploration of what makes Freddy Krueger resonate so powerfully with audiences across generations. Every great horror story begins with a kernel of truth that audiences recognize instinctively. Freddy Krueger's origin taps into something universally understood: the vulnerability of childhood and the devastating consequences when protective systems fail. His backstory centers on a child born into impossible circumstances, unwanted before taking his first breath. The fictional town of Springwood, Ohio becomes the setting for this tragedy. A woman named Amanda bears a son under circumstances shrouded in darkness and shame. Her own past contains trauma, institutionalization, abuse, experiences that polite society preferred to lock away rather than address. The child she brings into the world carries the weight of these unacknowledged horrors from his very beginning. This is where Freddy's story strikes its first chord of recognition. We've all witnessed or heard about children born into difficult circumstances, marked by society as somehow lesser before they've had any chance to prove themselves. The judgment comes swift and merciless, particularly in small communities where secrets fester and difference breeds fear. Young Freddy grows up essentially abandoned, even while technically having a parent. Amanda, fragmented by her own unprocessed trauma, cannot provide the nurturing every child needs. The boy finds himself utterly alone, surrounded by people, yet isolated in the most fundamental way. His only companions become silence and shadows, metaphors for the internal world he retreats to when the external one proves too hostile. The most chilling aspect of Freddy's origin isn't supernatural. It's the systematic failure of every institution that should protect vulnerable children. Other kids torment him relentlessly, calling him curse, treating him as something fundamentally wrong. This bullying happens in plain sight, yet remains somehow invisible to every adult with the power to intervene. Teachers look away. Neighbors close their curtains when he passes. The community collectively decides this child doesn't deserve basic compassion or protection. It's a pattern that plays out in reality far too often. The child most in need of help becomes the one everyone finds easiest to ignore. When you're already marked as other, as troublesome, as the product of shameful circumstances, society feels justified in its neglect. Freddy learns early to hide his pain, to control the rage and fear churning inside him. But emotions suppressed don't disappear, they transform. Inside this abandoned child, something begins to burn, a fury that will eventually consume everything around it. This psychological truth forms the foundation of his later transformation into something monstrous. The pivotal moment in Freddy's story comes with catastrophic loss. His mother dies violently in a fire, and he witnesses the destruction of his last connection to humanity. For a child already teetering on the edge, already deeply damaged by years of abuse and neglect, this final trauma shatters something beyond repair. After that night, the boy essentially dies even though his body survives. What emerges is something else entirely, a presence consumed by rage, disconnected from normal human emotion, driven by an overwhelming need for revenge against a world that showed him only cruelty. This transformation from victim to victimizer represents one of horror's most potent and disturbing patterns. The genius of Freddy Krueger as a horror concept lies in making him a creature of dreams. This isn't arbitrary, it's psychologically sophisticated. Dreams represent our unconscious minds, the realm where suppressed fears and traumas reside. By making Freddy attack in dreams, the mythology suggests that what we refuse to confront in waking life will eventually hunt us in sleep. Freddy discovers he can weaponize fear itself. In the dream realm, he becomes invincible, able to manipulate reality according to nightmare logic. He reads his victims' deepest anxieties, and constructs elaborate traps tailored to their specific terrors. The more they fear him, the stronger he becomes, a feedback loop that mirrors how anxiety operates in real psychology. His iconic bladed glove isn't just a weapon, it's a symbol. Each blade represents pain received and now inflicted outward. It's the physical manifestation of how hurt people, how trauma can transform victims into perpetrators when left unhealed. Every slash represents not just physical harm, but an assault on the victim's psyche. The curse Freddy embodies is simple yet devastating. Those who dream of him won't wake up alive. This creates a cycle of terror that spreads through communities like contagion. Sleep, the most basic biological necessity, becomes terrifying. The 1/3 of life we spend unconscious and vulnerable becomes a hunting ground where no one is safe. What makes Freddy Krueger enduringly fascinating is his complexity. He's not evil incarnate, he's the product of systematic cruelty. His reign of terror represents revenge against everyone who rejected him, against a society that looked away when he needed protection. On some level, his fury reflects genuine injustice, which makes him simultaneously horrifying and tragic. This duality is crucial. To some viewers, Freddy represents a corrupted victim, someone destroyed by abandonment who became the monster society created. To others, he's simply merciless evil, a demon without redemption. Both readings coexist, making his story richer and more disturbing. It forces audiences to grapple with uncomfortable questions about responsibility and consequence. As Freddy's power grows in the films, his presence distorts not just dreams, but reality itself. Victims live in terrifying limbo, unable to distinguish waking from sleeping. This psychological assault, the complete erosion of safe space, the total loss of boundaries between real and unreal, taps into primal fears about sanity and control. Law enforcement in Springwood tries to rationalize the disappearances, to explain away mounting evidence. But denial only strengthens Freddy's hold. His legend grows with each terror-filled night, fed by the community's refusal to confront what's happening. This mirrors how real communities often respond to ongoing abuse with disbelief, rationalization, and a desperate desire to maintain normalcy rather than acknowledge difficult truths. Yet even in this nightmare, Freddy isn't truly invincible. His weaknesses connect to the very past that created him. Defeating him requires confronting not just the monster, but the pain and abandonment that birthed the nightmare. It demands that victims acknowledge their own fears rather than fleeing from them, a requirement that proves psychologically impossible for most people. The few who survive encounters with Freddy pay a terrible price. Their sanity becomes fragile, forever marked by experiences that seem impossible, yet remain horrifyingly real. They carry invisible wounds, a mixture of trauma and hard-won courage. These survivors represent everyone who's faced overwhelming darkness and somehow emerged, fundamentally changed but still standing. Amid overwhelming terror, the Nightmare on Elm Street films present unlikely heroes, typically teenagers who decide to fight rather than flee. They're armed with nothing but courage and desperate will to survive. This choice to resist, even against impossible odds, becomes the narrative's moral center. These young people search for weaknesses in Freddy's power, ways to break his curse. But every attempt seems only to strengthen him, proving that the true enemy isn't any physical form, but the fear he represents. Victory requires mental strength rather than physical combat, the ability to face one's deepest terrors without flinching. This psychological dimension elevates Freddy beyond typical slasher villains. He's not simply strong or unkillable, he's empowered by his victims' own minds. Each battle becomes a dance between life and death, where fear itself is the adversary. Those who find courage despite overwhelming terror discover inner strength that no external force can erase. In the end, Freddy Krueger functions as more than entertainment. He's a dark mirror reflecting what we create when we allow hate and rejection to consume vulnerable people. His story asks uncomfortable questions. What happens to children we fail to protect? What monsters do we make through collective neglect? What price does society pay for looking away from suffering? The character resonates because on some level, we recognize these patterns. We've witnessed systems failing children, communities ignoring abuse, institutions prioritizing appearance over protection. Freddy represents the shadow side of social order, all the cruelty we permit, all the trauma we refuse to address, coming back in monstrous form. His existence in the dream realm adds another layer of meaning. Dreams are where our unconscious speaks to us, where suppressed emotions surface. By making Freddy a dream demon, the mythology suggests that what we push down during waking hours, our guilt, our complicity, our unacknowledged fears, will eventually demand recognition, even if through nightmare. The bladed glove, his most recognizable feature, embodies the weaponization of pain. It's crafted from the instruments of ordinary life, knives, tools, transformed into implements of revenge. This mirrors how trauma can take the mundane experiences of daily life and render them dangerous. How PTSD can turn normal situations into triggers. Freddy's burned appearance tells its own story, the physical manifestation of being consumed by rage, of burning away everything recognizably human until only vengeful purpose remains. The scars map trauma directly onto the body, making internal damage visible externally. His power growing with fear reflects genuine psychological dynamics. Anxiety feeds on itself. The more we fear something, the more power we grant it over our lives. Breaking free requires confrontation, facing what terrifies us rather than running. The few characters who survive Freddy do so by finding courage despite overwhelming odds, by refusing to let fear paralyze them completely. Freddy Krueger has remained culturally relevant for decades because his story touches something fundamental about human psychology and social dynamics. He represents consequences, what happens when we fail each other, when trauma goes unaddressed, when society's protective mechanisms break down. The genius of making him attack through dreams is that it removes any possibility of escape. Sleep is non-negotiable. Eventually, exhaustion forces even the most determined person back into vulnerability. This mirrors how trauma works. You can't simply will it away or stay vigilant forever. Eventually, it catches you in moments of weakness. His character also explores the transformation from victim to victimizer, one of psychology's most disturbing patterns. People who experience abuse, particularly in childhood, face increased risk of later becoming abusers themselves. Not because abuse is destiny, but because untreated trauma can warp perception and behavior in devastating ways. Freddy embodies this cycle taken to its ultimate extreme. Beyond the scares and special effects, Freddy Krueger's story carries a warning about collective responsibility. When communities fail to protect their most vulnerable members, when institutions look away from abuse, when society deems certain children disposable, consequences follow. Not necessarily in the form of supernatural monsters, but in very real cycles of violence and trauma that impact generations. The horror lies not in burned faces or bladed gloves, but in recognition. We create the conditions for real monsters every time we ignore a child's suffering, dismiss a victim's pain, or allow systematic cruelty to continue unchallenged. Freddy represents the return of everything we've tried to suppress, bury, or forget, all the collective guilt manifesting in nightmare form. His victims can't simply wake up and escape. The trauma follows them into waking life, eroding their grip on reality, destroying their sense of safety. This parallels how real trauma operates. It doesn't stay contained in the past, but bleeds into every aspect of present experience, making nowhere feel truly safe. The film suggests that defeating Freddy requires more than physical combat. It demands psychological transformation. Victims must confront their own inner demons, acknowledge their guilt and pain, face the darkness within themselves. Only by accepting these difficult truths can they strip Freddy of his power. This represents sophisticated psychological insight. Our own fears are often our greatest enemies. The parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge our capacity for cruelty. Our complicity in others' suffering, our own traumas, can sabotage us if left unexamined. Freddy thrives on denial and suppression. Confronting him means confronting ourselves. The teenagers who fight back in the films aren't stronger or braver by nature. They're ordinary people who find extraordinary courage when faced with impossible circumstances. Their resistance, however small, threatens to break the cycle of fear and death. This suggests that individual courage, even against overwhelming odds, matters profoundly. Freddy Krueger has transcended his original films to become a cultural touchstone, a reference point for discussing nightmares and fear itself. His image-burned face, striped sweater, bladed glove is instantly recognizable worldwide. But the character's real legacy lies in what he represents about trauma, revenge, and the monsters society creates. He reminds us that evil rarely emerges fully formed. It develops through accumulated pain, through systematic failure, through the small cruelties we permit and the suffering we ignore. Monsters are made, not born, shaped by circumstances that could have been different if anyone had intervened with compassion. The dream element ensures Freddy can never be entirely defeated in our cultural imagination. Dreams are universal, inescapable. Everyone sleeps, everyone dreams, everyone experiences nightmares. By connecting his mythology to this fundamental human experience, Freddy achieves a kind of immortality that transcends individual films. Freddy Krueger's story ultimately asks, can we defeat what lives inside us? Can fear be overcome, or are we doomed to cycles of trauma and revenge? The answer proves complex. Fear itself isn't the enemy, it's a natural response to danger. The enemy is fear that controls us, trauma that remains unprocessed, pain that transforms into rage. Breaking these cycles requires confronting darkness, both external and internal. It means acknowledging our capacity for cruelty, recognizing when we've failed others, and choosing courage despite overwhelming terror. It means creating systems that actually protect vulnerable people rather than failing them systematically. Every person who faces their fears, who resists internal terror, weakens the shadow Freddy represents. The true battle isn't against external monsters, but within ourselves, where courage and fear wage endless war. Understanding this transforms Freddy from simple villain to complex symbol of everything we struggle with regarding trauma, responsibility, and the nature of evil itself. Freddy Krueger endures because he touches profound truths about human psychology and social dynamics. He's a mirror showing us what we become when we allow hate and rejection to fester, when we fail to protect the vulnerable, when we look away from suffering because acknowledgement feels too uncomfortable. His story reminds us that monsters don't emerge from nowhere. They're created through accumulated cruelty, through systematic failure, through our collective choices to ignore what should demand action. And once created, these monsters, whether literal or metaphorical, can haunt us indefinitely unless we find courage to confront both them and the conditions that created them. The next time you think about Freddy Krueger, remember he represents more than fictional terror. He symbolizes real consequences of abandonment, the very real damage done when protective systems fail. He asks us to examine our own shadows, confront our fears, and acknowledge our responsibilities to each other. True horror doesn't lie in burned faces or supernatural powers. It lives in our capacity for cruelty, our willingness to look away, our tendency to create conditions where darkness flourishes. Freddy Krueger, in all his nightmare horror, holds up a mirror to these uncomfortable truths, reminding us that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones we make ourselves.